depth, we're adding tone, and we're adding more possibilities and more inspiration as to what we want to play on over that. So the next set of chords I'd like to go through for you are a set that I find that I use constantly in my music, and it adds, again, a big openness to the sound, and it adds a lot more possibilities to what I can play over it. So it's a very inspiring sound of these chords. These are basically in the key of E or the key of C sharp minor, which are relative major and minor, but it has the open B and the open E in them. I think it makes a huge difference on some chords. So let's go through them right now. The first one would be basically an E power chord. So instead of hearing this, you're going to hear this. Okay? A lot more open. Now you can move this shape right down to B. Moving it down to that A, add 9. Now you can take different forms too. You have a B, or you can take a B here. If you use that, you have Ozzy's Can't Kill Rock and Roll. Now you can bend this E chord around a lot too, where, for instance, one of my favorite things to do is to drop the E to a D sharp. So you're implying a B almost, but it's almost like a B with an E bass. How I think of it. You could also say it's an E major 7, but I think of it as more of a B form with an E bass. So for instance, just dropping this right here, there's a song on Melodica called This Time, and that's what the whole basic riff is out of. Okay, very simple. Also, there's some wider chords that I like to use. Again, adding that 9 in there with the open B and the open E, we have something like this. Instead of an E this way, we have this. Move this down. And you have a very nice lush chords. Now I also have some nice variations in there, again, referring back to some of my favorite chords. First inversion chord, I think I've made it pretty clear how much I love that chord. So if we use an E chord, and went to a B chord first inversion, I remember a B chord first inversion as we went through it before would be this. But so I'm gonna drop that bass to D sharp, and I'm also gonna drop the E to D sharp while leaving those E and B's open. All we're really doing is we're messing with the form a little bit, trying to kind of melt it into other chords. E first inversion. Now, taking this approach, we could also get a lot of mileage out of thinking about the key of E. We have E, F sharp minor, G sharp minor, all right? Do a kind of a minor 7 shape, but we add that high E and B again. G sharp. You can view this two different ways. You can almost view it as a G sharp minor shape with a high E and B, or it almost is an E first inversion, but a different voicing for it. For some stuff, it's very nice, like that. Do the same thing for F sharp minor. Right there, I'm almost using it as a first inversion in E. Bringing in our first inversion from before as a connector chord, as a modulator. Sus4. Now, one of my songs called I'm All Right, that's exactly how it started out, was just me kind of messing around with these open chords, and I came up with this progression. And that's the first thing I came up with those chords. Now, instead of going to this chord, you could also alter the bass. It's a different sound again. You have this, or you have this. And again, you can do all this kind of stuff because you have the E and the B constantly ringing through. And of course, on the bridge, and I'm all right, the first bridge, we're going to use those first inversion chords we went through earlier. Again. Now, something I want to talk about here as we start, you see how I'm bending different chords around and changing roots, is just because you have a chord in a certain root position, that doesn't mean that you can't add different basses and roots to it to make it sound interesting. So, for instance, I have a song called Everything I Should Have Said, which is a B chord. But I changed the root around a little bit. Which always works very nicely. So again, we're keeping a constant. The chord is strong enough to stand on its own, and as you start messing around, also, speaking about chords with the open E and B in it, I have a tune called Lift off of Staring at the Sun that sounds something like this. So that's the opening chord sequence in it. Now, talking about all these different variations you can do with the E's and the B's and moving chords around, you'll see that I don't really stick to stock chords. I always kind of try to bend them a little bit and mesh them with other chords. And I think that's where you start getting the interesting sounds and tonalities. You start bending stuff. And so something I like to talk about now is actually taking chords keeping the chords constant and then changing the roots around them. So you have the constant chord, change the roots around them, and all of a sudden you get some very interesting effects. So for instance, using that B chord that I showed you for lift, let's take that chord and change the root around a little bit, and you'll have the intro to a tune of mine called Everything I Should Have Said. Something like that. Again, there's the B chord, but I'm changing the root. Okay. Now also some of the chords that we just went through are great examples of stuff that you can change roots on. So like that C sharp minor. See how I'm just moving it around. C sharp minor with a G sharp bass. Nice open sound. Take for instance a B minor. B minor, I just dropped the B to A bass. I try to hold the chord as constant as I can, but as you move, sometimes have to revoice a little bit. First inversion add 9. 9. Connect chord with a first inversion add 9. Now we've been talking about chords with that open E and the B, adding a big wider voice to it, but you don't always have to use the open E and B. There's other strings on the guitar. And a good example of this would be a song off of Staring at the Sun called Lost in Your Dream. What I did is, first of all, I capoed, and we'll talk a little bit more about capoing later. Okay, and I just took a B minor, and I opened up the middle of it to an open G. And just the difference between this and this is all the world difference. And again, as we just talked about, just dropping the bass on this one chord, but keeping that open G in there, or in this case it would be a B flat with the capo. And this is a classic example of an A first inversion with the capo, of course, but we drop that and do that open string. A few of my other favorite chords are, I'd like to go through right now for you. Again, strange chords bring on strange ideas, bring on real cool melodies, bring on whole different feels to tunes. So again, instead of playing maybe a standard E minor, one of my favorite things is an E minor add 9. So much more depth then. Okay. Also, one of my favorite chords would have to be this one right here. I use it in a progression as more of a C chord. You can analyze it a few different ways. So let me show you where I use some of these chords at. If I was to capo again. There's a tune on melodica called All My Life, and the intro sounds like this. And again, I'm using A sus4, referring to the chord with the capo. Adjust that. So using the progression I just talked about, or the chord I just talked about, being that E minor add 9. E minor add 9, our strange C chord, and again, our good old friend, the D first inversion. Things with it. Also, I like to go back to talking about some open string things. Again, referencing the capo, if we reference this as a F first inversion add 9, there's a piece on there. The solo to All My Life sounds like this. Gives it that little demented feel. Also, there's some real nice chords that you might want to try. A few of my favorites at this moment would be something like this. Sort of lends itself, kind of a Pink Floyd feel. Put that phaser on. So in other words, what we have just went over, I think really shows that chords really are the building blocks of what we do in any solo. So we set ourselves up to really listen and really kind of play off of some chords. We set ourselves up with some very interesting chords. I think our solos are going to be so much more creative and so much more inventive, and I think that we're really going to touch a lot more people than maybe playing standard power chords, because we have so much more voicing to choose from. So those are chords. All right, taking this concept of chords and starting to apply it to actually playing leads with it, I have something called tone clusters that I use. And tone clusters for me are nothing more than groupings of little pieces of chords, little triads around the neck that I can go to, and I can play either leads, melodies, chords, double stops, and it really is a melodic approach to it because everything in that little cluster just lends itself to playing melodically. So let me show you what I'm talking about. So for instance, the first one, let's say we were in the key of E major. Obviously a little E major chord. But I view this little E major triad as a group of notes around it. So for instance, okay, that's one of them. And as you can see, it's not just the cluster or not just the triad itself, but it's all the surrounding notes. So you can use it as a chord, something like that. So I'll show you application with them in a second. Okay, the second grouping, if we're in the key of E, is based off of this E major. It's something like this. Again, it's based off of E major. Combine the two. Okay, also another one based off of this E major chord. So you almost have all these. Okay. And the final one would be this shape. So off of this shape, again, a different position of that one. Okay, so how can we use them? Well, let's use them just as little chord clusters, first of all, not worrying about actually playing leads over them, but more melodies. So for instance, I have a tune called Everything I Should Have Said off of Sing, the song. And I use these tone clusters in the key of B, so it sounds something like this. So taking these and using these to play some melodies, maybe not leads yet, but just maybe some double stops. I have a tune on Sing called Everything I Should Have Said. It sounds something like this. But now the verse, I work off of B and E with these little double stops. So. Oh my God. Do it again. Let me just start playing that here. And as you can see, I start out with a B major chord, go right down to A. There's that double stop. All these are out of B. There's that add 9. Okay? Same thing could be said for a tune off of Melodica called This Time. The basic melody is double stops with these tone clusters. So the again, beginning. Little triads. Back to shape. And the ending riff. Okay. Also, I have a tune off of Sing called Journey to Texas. It sounds something like this. And that kind of encompasses everything we've talked about up until this point. We have tone cluster with a low E bass. Okay, adding a little tension. So I was playing an E sus4 with a C sharp bass, or you can analyze it another way, I'm sure. And there's that B first inversion add 9. Also taking this philosophy, there's a song on one of my Christmas records called Come Let Us Adore Him, the old Christmas classic that uses this tone cluster philosophy. That. Or take something like I'm All Right. And that, again, keeping in the key of E. Continuing on to the very end. Now, if you look at that very end, it's everything we've talked about up to this point. It just keeps building. So we have E chord, first inversion add 9s, tone cluster on the B, tone cluster riff on the key of E, or on the chord of E. Again, building on all of these chord different patterns and different movements that we've been talking about, I like to talk about what I call skeleton chords. And skeleton chords, merely for my understanding, are just outlines of chords, which are just the root tones, 1, 3, and 5. And I pick them with my thumb, first and third finger. But kind of taking out all the duplicate notes, it really cleans up the chord, and it gives it a very sparse, kind of almost a haunting sound. Okay, I use this on the beginning of I'm All Right in a live setting. On record, it's captured on the Snap, Crackle, Pop record. And all that is bringing your volume down and using the same chords we've talked about. Now, some chords I'll stay with 3 notes. And then some chords I'll bring in the full voice. Bringing in our friend, the first inversion. E chord with an A bass, B add 9. So you can see how these really have a real pretty sound, very majestic sound. And of course, turn the heat up on them. They sound good with gain or without. It all starts from this. I'd like to talk about how I view scales and modes and what scales and modes I use in my playing. I always seem to get the question, what are my favorite scales? What scales do I play? What scales do I rely on the most? So let me answer that by stepping back and relating everything to the scale that we as guitar players, every one of us knows. Every rock song was based on it, and you can make $1 million playing it, although I have not as of yet, which is the pentatonic scale. So obviously I use the pentatonic scale in basically every song I do because I basically am a rock player. So obviously pentatonic. But where it works for me is I utilize the relationship between minor and major, the relative major and minors. I utilize that all throughout the neck and in every song. So for instance, let me show you. A pentatonic is, by another name, is a minor pentatonic. It's a minor scale, or the minor scale. Pentatonic meaning 5 notes. meaning that it's 5 notes out of the minor scale. So basically, we can treat it as a minor scale. So if I was playing something in A minor,